This is the mower that cut the lawn, where you laid on your back so a princess could fly.
Hello and welcome to Natural World Facts. Today I'll be teaching you how to create a closed terrarium. A terrarium is an enclosed ecosystem which can be entirely self-sustaining. Once set up and watered, you will never need to open it again, since it will regulate its own water and nutrient cycles. Before we begin, you will need an airtight container. Some good examples include glass jars with clip tops, screw-on lids, or corks, but for my example I'll be using a large round display jar with a lid which sits comfortably on top, allowing it to retain the moisture in the air. Other equipment you will need includes porous mesh which allows water through but not substrate, some rocks or gravel, some activated carbon for fish tank filters or charcoal, and a selection of small to medium-sized local plants and mosses. The first step is to place about an inch of stones or gravel in the base of your container. For this example, I'll be using these coloured rocks since they're all I have readily available, but any aquarium gravel or pebbles should do. Next, sprinkle on a coating of activated carbon sticks or charcoal to help with filtration. The next step is to cut out the shape of the base of your container from the porous mesh. It needs to cover the gravel layer entirely, so it's best to cut it slightly larger than the shape itself. Once this is in place over the gravel, you can add the soil. The purpose of this gravel layer is to separate the standing water from the soil to avoid roots rotting. The water will collect here as a water reservoir, then will evaporate, condensate on the walls of your glass container, and then fall back down into the substrate, effectively replicating the natural water cycle. This will ensure that the terrarium will naturally water itself. Moving on to the soil. A good soil mix should retain moisture well and be a mix of dead leaves, moss and compost. The soil layer should be deeper than your gravel layer to allow root space. Next, let's add some plants to the terrarium. I will be making this a native terrarium, so I'll be using plants from nearby parks and gardens. You could use tropical plants for yours instead. Place your choice of plants in the terrarium, paying close attention to your arrangement and how you would like it to look aesthetically. Think about putting larger plants in the background and smaller ones in the foreground. Moss is excellent for ground covering.
Today I'm going to show you how to make a closed terrarium. You're going to need a large glass vessel like this with an airtight lid. The bottom of the terrarium should be a drainage layer. Fill the bottom 2 inches with pebbles of various sizes to hold the main water reservoir. On top of that, you'll need to put in a mesh filter. I've bought some insect mesh for this. Cut it to size, slightly bigger than the diameter of your container, and adjust it into place. You can do this with tweezers. Above the mesh, I'm putting a layer of activated charcoal which will filter the water as it drains through. Now I'm going to add a substrate layer. I've got a mixture of soil which I collected and some normal potting compost. I sterilise the soil for 15 minutes at 200 degrees Celsius. I'm also adding horticultural grit for a little bit of drainage. You can create a topography with the substrate to get the look you want. The plants that I've got for my terrarium are Asplenium osaka, I've got Fittonia bambino, and Peperomia pepper spot. And I've also got some lovely moss which I've collected from a street nearby. A useful tool to adjust the plants into place are long tweezers. but be careful you don't crush the delicate stems. Now add any large stones or little bits of wood if you want to give it a natural look. Have fun placing the moss like a little patchwork around the plants. When you've finished arranging everything, you can water. I'm using rainwater, which I've sterilised through boiling and cooling, but you can use distilled. I'm pouring a small amount in to soak into the compost and also spraying it to moisten the moss on top. But be careful not to add too much. That was so much fun. All I need to do now is put the lid on and then place it near a window out of direct sunlight so it gets enough light but without scorching the leaves. If you find it's got a little bit too much condensation on the sides, then you can leave the lid off for a little while and let some of the water evaporate. It's as easy as that.
life on the farm is kinda laid back. Ain't much an old country boy like me can't hack. It's early to rise, early in the sack. I thank God I'm a country boy. Well, a simple kind of life never did me no harm. Thank God I'm a country boy.
For the past 2 years that I've been consistently active on YouTube, a lot of you have asked me to do a setup for carnivorous plants, with a lot of those requests being for Venus flytraps. I kept saying in comments that I would eventually do something with them, and the time has finally come. The reason that I put this off for so long is that there are some logistical issues with keeping Venus flytraps in a terrarium. As a result, this is an experimental build that may or may not be successful. I will talk more about that as we work through the build, but I think we may be able to pull something off. Anyways, let's get into the build. I've been in and out of Walmart several times in the past few weeks. They've had Venus flytraps in the garden section, but no one was buying them. Naturally, I felt sorry for the plants because no one wanted them, and I decided that it was finally time to do this build. So I bought 3 of them at $5 a piece in hopes to make a cool terrarium. As I said earlier, there are some issues with keeping flytraps in a terrarium. This is largely because these plants have specialized care requirements. Since they are a temperate plant, they need a cool, dormant period to survive long term. This is by far the thing that has me most concerned, but it may be less of an issue than I originally thought. Keep this in mind because we'll revisit it near the end of the video. Another specialized aspect about caring for flytraps are their substrate requirements. Unlike most plants that obtain nutrients through the soil, flytraps, like other carnivorous plants, receive their nutrients from eating insects. Therefore, any nutrients present within the substrate will actually be harmful to the plant, so we're going to have to mix up a custom substrate blend. Much like the substrate that we typically use for terrariums, we want this substrate to drain well, resist compaction, and stay moist without becoming soggy. To achieve this, we're going to use 3 components, including dried sphagnum moss, peat moss, and quartz sand. When choosing these components, it's extremely important to find ones that aren't enriched with nutrients. The reason being that we want this substrate to be as absent of nutrients as possible. Now then, we'll get roughly 1 part of peat moss, 2 parts of dried sphagnum moss, and 1 part of quartz sand and mix them together. After everything is thoroughly mixed together, you should end up with something that looks like this. There are other substrate mixes that could work, but this one seemed like it would work well for a terrarium and will fulfill the plant's needs. Of course, we're also going to need a suitable container. I already had this awesome jar in my stockpile, and although I was saving it for something else, I knew it would be perfect for this build. Plus, that gives me the excuse to buy another one later on. When choosing a container for this build, you're going to want something that's decently sized because these plants can get somewhat large. Now we're ready to build the terrarium. First, let's start out with a false bottom. We'll make this just like we would for other terrariums, using gravel and carbon fiberglass window screen mesh. Here I just have a bit of black gravel and some spare window screen from previous builds. When cutting this out, I find it easiest to use an object that's slightly larger than the diameter of the container as a guide. In this case, a bucket. So in combination with an X-Acto knife, I use this bucket as a guide and cut out the mesh.
Feels weird picking it up. The legacy.
With the mesh cut out, we can dump the gravel into the jar, which I did using a folded piece of paper. I recommend going more generous on this layer for fly traps than we would for other plants. Just like in other terrariums, this layer will help keep standing water separate from the plant's roots, among other things. After getting a good layer of gravel down in the jar, the window screen was then put in place. Now we'll move on to the substrate layer. To add this component, I used a piece of paper again. As I dumped it into the container, I also evened it out with a fan brush. Before we move on, you may be wondering why I didn't add a charcoal layer. Well, I suspect that charcoal will add unwanted nutrients into the terrarium, and as I expressed earlier, that's not something that the flytraps will take kindly to. After getting a nice layer of substrate in the container, we could then unpot the flytraps. In doing so, you want to be as gentle as possible to avoid overstressing the plant. As such, I'm leaving some of the existing substrate around the base of the plant. From here, I planted one of the flytraps in the back of the container using various tools. I only started with one so that I could get a feel for how I wanted to hardscape everything from there. Afterward, I got some black lava rock and hardscaped a portion of the terrarium. I didn't really have a set idea in mind for this, so I just let the scape take shape on its own. After scaping for a bit, I placed an additional fly trap. Then I continued to scape the terrarium. Eventually, I got to the point where I could start adding some moss and liverwort. Like the fly traps, these are temperate mosses, so they shouldn't have any issue going through a dormant period. However, my only concern with adding these mosses is that they may contaminate the setup with unwanted nutrients, but I guess we'll see what happens. Using my tweezers, I went through the terrarium and placed patches of moss in a way that I found aesthetically pleasing. During this process, I also added some more lava rocks and a third Venus flytrap. Eventually, I ended up with the final design seen here. That said, we're going to have to add some water before we can call it quits. In doing so, you will have to use distilled water, reverse osmosis water, or rainwater. Pretty much any other type of water is going to have minerals in it, which unfortunately would kill your fly trap. I picked up a gallon of distilled water at Walmart for around $1, so it's not hard to come by. If you plan this out ahead of time, you could just as easily get some rainwater totally free. Finally, when watering your terrarium, you want to add enough to moisten the substrate, but not so much that you create a soggy environment. Also, since this is an open container, I'm going to have to periodically add more water.
The harvest is in your hands, but your perfect tomato.
Overall, I like how this terrarium turned out, and I'm hoping that we can get it to last long term. As I said, Venus flytraps are a temperate plant which require a dormancy period. If you want your plant to last more than a few years, there's absolutely no way around it. During this period of time, the temperature will more or less cause the plant to go to sleep, where it will reawaken in the spring. To replicate this natural cycle, I will most likely put my terrarium in the garage, just in front of the window. I'll keep my terrarium there for around 3 or 4 months before bringing it back inside, and wait and see what happens. And haven't done so, be sure to do so and hit the notification